Griddy.
Hit him with the griddy.
Mike Bolduck, or simply just Griddy, is an avid drafter of Underdog's paid Bestball tournaments, going by the username HitEmWithTheGriddy18. Griddy, like many badge bros, has entered the 150 max entries into this tournament. The maximum 150 entries equals $3,750 in entry fees. He thinks he's smarter than the rest of the field by assuming, like many fantasy players, that the game is all luck. In a way, Griddy's underdog story is like the man he obsesses over. The mere mention of Claypool being upstage made Griddy respond in a way Pittsburgh Steeler Chase Claypool probably would. By being a salty little Claypool, with him being released from the Buffalo Bills. This is probably one of his worst here. Round 11 as his first receiver. This is 0 receiver. Griddy tries to defend his draft strategies, particularly with triple quarterback, using the ping pong method. Griddy will have to have 2 outcomes happen for him to succeed, and both have to happen. Almost all of them have been the guy you need. Griddy tried to prove the 3 QB strat by using a team from last year off Bestball Mania database. This team did not even advance their pod. Griddy is a contrarian that thrives on ambiguity and doubt. Griddy has a particular disease that inflicts groups like flat earthers, moon landing deniers, and Cowboys fans.
Stick it to Demon, Neosis.
I'm gonna lie, I'm pretty shook seeing that I have an 8% advance rate right now. I'm gonna spend the whole fucking year. Me and Griddy are gonna have the same Jaccard and the same advance rate. I don't know.
No,
I don't know if I can handle it.
Griddy's advancing like 25% of his teams right now. He has an insane advance rate. Yeah, you don't want to. You're not at the same level as Griddy right now.
Yeah, I'm not the same level as
Claypool.
Maybe I'll just auto draft next year.
Want to give a shout out to Griddy, who I'm going to say is directionally accurate on his Chase Claypool love.
It turns out the tree didn't just look beautiful, it sounded beautiful. This is when the tree became the tree.
Hit him with the Griddy is like going to lead the field in advance rate this year. Turns out, just like taking zeros is worse than having bad structure.
Lil Jordan Humphrey gets drafted.
Griddy. Griddy. Griddy.
Derrick Henry on the run. Henry Lewis chasing at the 40, at the 30. He will score.
Maybe I'll just auto draft next year.
Alright people, let's do this one last time. Davis Mattek is a fantasy football content creator and an avid drafter of Bestball tournaments. He has gotten a considerable following for his hilarious Bestball takes.
It was Josh Palmer is the Panthers' Adam Thielen of Cortland Sutton's.
That honestly rings true.
That honestly
that's right. No, I think that is right.
His Bestball Mania giveaway and his obsession with the Kansas City Chiefs. He started his YouTube channel over the off-season after being fired from his job and has gotten a considerable amount of subscribers since. He spent $10,000 in total on Underdog Bestball Mania tournaments, and like Griddy, Davis has maxed Underdog's premier tournament, Bestball Mania 5. Interestingly, Mattek launched his YouTube brand by offering a giveaway to those who commented on his videos and live streams. The winner would receive 5% of Mattek's winnings from Bestball Mania 5.
Comment on my videos and I'm going to give away 5% of all my winnings in the Chow Chow post-tax. Make sure you read the T&Cs and have a lawyer also take a look at it. You might have to owe me money if I don't shit.
However, Mattek's year so far has been incredibly unfavorable. As I mentioned in the previous video, Bestball Mania is broken up into 4 rounds. Round 1 involves a 12-team draft where the top 2 players advance into round 2. Thus, drafters should expect to advance 1 out of every 6 teams, or 16% of the time. This is called the field, which is the expectation for drafters. As of this recording, Davis is advancing 13 of his 150 teams, or 8%. This is around half of what is expected for the average drafter.
Don't enter the giveaway. Don't, whatever money I win, I'm gonna need it.
Most of the money in this tournament is in week 17, and you have to advance to even match your $3,000 investment. For a tournament where 150 maxers only have a 12% chance of advancing to the final championship, cutting your odds in half is even more devastating for your hopes for serious money.
You do have to pay me if I lose, though. You can't have it both ways, dude. Quid pro quo.
What went wrong? Well, let's compare Mattek's results so far to Griddy's. Griddy, despite his obsession with Chase Claypool and the extreme triple elite QB and hero receiver strategies, has been much more successful. The Griddy school of thought has several rules, including
Stick it to Damon, Neosis.
drafting triple elite QB and hero receiver, and drafting large shares of old running backs like Derrick Henry. The Griddy school over the offseason has had some mixed followers, with some people endorsing the school and others, well...
Fiddle my gooch.
Apparently Mattek has not studied enough at the HitEmWithTheGriddy school of Bestball Mania. But as this game is often a product of the guy you need, let's look at Griddy schools, MVPs, and how Mattek has deviated from the Griddy school of advance rates. As Bestball drafters like Griddy and Mattek draft a lot of teams, they measure how much of a particular player they draft with exposure. In Bestball Mania, round 1 starts with a draft where you play 11 other players in a snake draft to build your team. In a single draft, 216 players will be drafted total, with each player ending up with an 18-man roster. In a 12-team draft like Bestball Mania, if a player is drafted in 100% of tournaments, and if we do enough drafts to be able to draft evenly at each draft position, we are at what is called the field in our draft portfolio. This field is like the advance rate field, but instead is 1 over 12 possible, or 8% of teams. Drafting at the field for every player would give you an 8% exposure to each player. Let's take a look at the players Griddy and Mattek drafted. Griddy takes players at several times the field. For example, 11 of his receivers are drafted at least 3 times the field, or 24%, with 2 of them being first-round picks. Claypool in particular is 72%, or exactly 9 times the field. This would mean he would be drafting him 9 times out of 12 if you drafted all of your players in a single round. Mattek did take some players at several times the field, but not even close to as extreme as Griddy. His highest drafted player was Xavier Worthy at 30%, which is about 3.5 times the field. That is around the exposure of Griddy's 21st most drafted player. Having 3 to 4 times the field will almost guarantee that you don't draft several other players. This is okay in the range Claypool is drafted, where many round 18 picks will not be relevant for fantasy anyway. But in earlier rounds, the guys you don't take can matter even more than the guys you do. Griddy takes his exposures all the way up to the first round. The players he faded are elite names virtually anyone who bothered to watch the video up to this point would know very well. Superstar talents like Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, Garrett Wilson, and Bijan Robinson are all absent from his $3,000 portfolio. In fact, Griddy deliberately chooses 4 receivers to draft in the first round every season, and doesn't draft any other first round player, including the first round running backs. This is the first rule Mattek breaks. He drafts all 12 of the first round picks and drafts the first round running backs. Griddy's 4 guys have all been generally successful, with 2 of them being top 5 receivers, and the others, they'll probably be okay for the rest of the season. Mattek also has his shares of Justin Jefferson, but also has the Sackreligious players like Breece Hall, Christian McCaffrey, and Bijan Robinson. Mattek commits heresy by ignoring the hero receiver rules. This act of sacrilege continues through rounds 2 to 3. For what it's worth, almost all of these players have either struggled or been hurt so far. Mattek's second mistake, however, is not taking the true elite RBs. Griddy took 62%, or around 7.5 times the field on Derrick Henry, who is currently the RB 1.5 PPR points per game. Mattek, on the other hand, drafted 1 share of Derrick Henry. Mattek's third mistake was betting on the wrong teams. For example, the Griddy school faded the Kansas City Chiefs overall this year. Griddy drafted a Chief on only 15%, or 23 teams total. Mattek, on the other hand, is a Chiefs fan and has a very heavy share of all of their players. His top player, Xavier Worthy, has a higher number of shares than the total shares of all of Griddy's Chiefs players combined.
Wow.
The Chiefs already have struggled with injuries to offensive weapons, with 2 players confirmed to have season-ending injuries already. Rice and Hollywood in particular account for 55 unique teams for Mattek, and are thus a dead roster spot on 36% of his teams. Mattek also didn't invest enough into the right team. For example, Griddy is a Ravens fan, and he really likes guys like Derrick Henry and Rashad Bateman.
Fiddle my gooch.
Compare this to Mattek, who is pretty sparse on all Ravens. Considering Derrick Henry and Lamar are both at the top of their positions in scoring, this is looking like another blunder.
Maybe I'll just auto draft next year.
That being said, round 1 is far from finished, and none of the success from Henry, Lamar, or any other player is going to matter once the playoff rounds hit. But Mattek is definitely going to struggle to advance teams into round 2 regardless.
What is this?
The tree. It turns out the tree didn't just look beautiful, it sounded beautiful. This is when the tree became the tree.
Pat Crane, founder and writer for the legendary Upside website and winner of Bestball Mania 2 in 2021, collaborated with fellow legendary Upside writer Sackreligious to develop the Jaccard Diversification Index, which measures how diversified an underdog drafter was. The Jaccard Diversification Index gives us a similarity coefficient and a diversification percentile. The wider the tree, the more diverse the draft was, and the lower the similarity coefficient was. Take, for example, our friend Pete Overzet. Last year he had a very high diversification percentile.
Well, the x-rays are done and we identified a very concerning tumor on your Jaccard similarity score.
Sackreligious also compared the most diversified teams to the least diversified teams. As you can see by the advance rates, players that drafted identical teams last year were often in very low percentiles of advancing. As Sackreligious mentions, the guy you need often comes down to a select few of players, and it's much more likely the guy you need is not the guy you want. We can even look at this graph and see that the top 20% of advancers often had a lower diversification index. So to summarize, teams that don't diversify have a greater risk of worse advance rates. Which brings us to Griddy and Mattek. Mattek had a diversity index of 0.06, which is the 30th percentile in diversity. This chart shows various different levels of diversity, with points closer to the center being more similar and less diverse. Mattek is less diverse when he has an early draft pick, which is likely due to Mahomes, Marquise Brown, and Travis Kelce falling in the earlier half of drafts.
Basically, as soon as I make my first round pick, the rest of my roster can basically just be filled out. Draft in the first spot.
Picks of similarity.
He's got 12 different teams just based on the first round. Just
Yes,
each other.
like that. Like yes, there's a Davis Mattek team from the 1, 2, the 3, the 4, the 5.
I just suggest Chiefs teams in a slightly different way as a potential YouTube title for you. You're gonna have to get a microscope out to see your card.
However, Mattek pales in comparison to Griddy's identical teams. Griddy, once again this year, is one of the least diverse players in Bestball Mania, with a similarity index of 0.244.
3.
Even if Griddy has a positive round 1 advance rate, the Griddy school still needs their guys to be the guy you need in the playoffs. That being said, as funny as Griddy's Jaccard tree is, having more similarity doesn't mean you have an inherently worse chance of being successful, or even that you have worse built teams. We discussed the Griddy school's draft construction theory in the last video. How you build teams and the combinations of players matter more than the players themselves. Here's good old Davis Mattek along with Bestball Mania winner Liam Murphy discussing this very point.
The idea is that you want to have concentrated exposures, but not concentrated teams.
Yes, and like HitEmWithTheGriddy is building the same team. That is bad because your risk of ruin is super high. But also, he's okay returning $0, so I don't think it's like that bad if your bankroll's big.
Also, I am like, I'm
Yes.
gonna lose all my money in BBM, and like that's fine. You know,
Yes, everyone is going to lose, so take some stands.
I'll
It's always
play.
been
I'll
my
play
mindset.
again. I'll play again next year. You know, like it is.
my-
It is what it is.
My Jaccard tree was terrible the year I won BBM 2 because I had 60% Gabe Davis. I had I could pull up my exposures, but I had 60% of like a round 10 player. That is not as risky though as having like last year. I think I had 50% Kincaid. That was more risky because Kincaid was more expensive, and it came at a round where all the running backs you want went, which like I knew going into the year I was being risky. So I don't know. Cool to look at.
However, Griddy's school likely won't be convinced by a 6% advancer, especially the follower of the conspiracy known as Big Receiver.
Stick it to Demon Neosis.
As I mentioned in the previous video, Griddy is obsessed with hero receiver and triple elite QB. But I didn't even go into detail on why the Griddy school even wants to draft their teams this way. Due to increasing prices on wide receivers this season, most underdog players have opted to draft 4 receivers within 7 rounds and 5 receivers within 10. Underdog content creator Hayden Winks made a great article about expected points added and breaks down the expected points for a receiver in 2023. As you can see on this graph, the Griddy school strategy of hero receiver, which is 2 receivers through round 10, is one of the lowest data points on this graph. Griddy has done several teams with 3 receivers by round 13, which was the lowest on this graph by far, 50 points worse than the average. The Griddy school views drafting receivers early as an overpay and has a very big stick it to the maniosis against big receiver. Griddy's perception of receivers being an overpay doesn't match the better and best ball points added for receivers, and especially doesn't match how receivers have historically scored. However, as I mentioned previously, many of the early receivers have struggled this year, but this is heavily influenced by injuries. Many of these struggling receivers can still be the guy you need in the playoff rounds, and round 1 isn't even close to finish. Remember, this game is won in week 17, not week 14. Griddy's dislike of big receiver is only matched by his disdain over the perceived hive mind that is ADP. ADP, or average draft position, as its name suggests, is the average position a given player is drafted over a certain season. As it's an average of drafters on Underdog, it is created by consensus. Players viewed as better bets for being the guy you need naturally are going to be drafted higher. The Griddy school loves other players going against ADP and retweets any tweets that talk against consensus.
ADP? More like average donkey price.
Griddy's drafts often involve him reaching for a player way above ADP, with many drafts having him reach on multiple players. While reaching on a player is perfectly fine in your regular leagues, particularly if you won't get the player with your next pick, reaching is not favorable in a large tournament like Bestball. In Mike Leone's Bestball Manifesto, he breaks down previous year's success based on what draft capital bucket they are put into. Draft capital is a measure of how valuable a player is based on expected fantasy points. ADP draft capital dramatically decreases in the first 6 to 8 rounds and then starts to noticeably flatten after round 10. Based on this assigned draft capital, Leone placed drafts into certain draft capital buckets, with 1 being the highest draft capital and 10 being the lowest. Leone's data indicates players in the low draft capital buckets in Bestball Mania 3 had a significantly lower round 1 advance rate, playoff final success, and expected value. As Best Ball Mania drafts were open from the first weeks of May up until around Labor Day, teams drafted have much different ADPs depending on when they were drafted. Underdog players use the term closing line value to compare the final September ADP to other points in the season. This is significant as September drafters had the largest advantage in information from training camp and the preseason. The site Best Ball Explorer uses Leone's draft capital calculations to allow players to see their draft capital gained or lost, and thus their closing line value. Griddy gave us his Best Ball Explorer data so we can use this to determine the draft capital of players he's drafted. While Griddy did not give us his overall team draft capital, we can infer his total draft capital by using one of my teams as an example. This team has a closing line value draft capital of negative 51.5, which places it in bucket 9 or the bottom 10th percentile. This would mean I would have a pretty large loss in EV and worse overall advance rates. You might notice the red across my draft capital CLV column, meaning having multiple negative draft capital differentials adds up. Having multiple players with negative CLV is going to lead to negative team CLV. The idea behind closing line value is late August teams have an advantage in information and thus have more accurate projection for player stats. Here is Pete Overzet exemplifying why drafting with new information in August is important.
You ADP bros disgust me.
The dead period is over and training camps provide us with even more information to digest and act on. This is the time of year last year we started to get tidbits that Kyren Williams was the clear RB2 in Los Angeles and that Cam Akers was falling out of favor with the team. It's natural to be skeptical of puff pieces from training camp, but we also need to realize that we have information that May and June drafters didn't have access to, and that's an angle we should look to exploit when possible. August last year is when Puka Nacua really came into focus as a late round dart throw. And not only was Puka an objectively good pick in a vacuum because of his projected role in 3 wide receiver sets for the Rams offense, but he had not been getting drafted during the majority of the contest. The main things we want to do here is leverage all of this new information that early drafters don't have access to and try to build unique teams with players and combos that earlier drafters couldn't take advantage of.
Pete gives 3 examples last year of really strong picks that were only really drafted in July and August, one of which being the guy you need, Kyren Williams. The benefit of information works in reverse too. A player we know is likely not to be as good is not going to be drafted by August drafters as high. This gives August players a discount on falling players or simply allows them to not have a 0 at the position if the player is likely to not be fantasy relevant. For example, on my team, players like Marshawn Lloyd, Kendrick Bourne, and DeAndre Hopkins all fell considerably due to training camp injury news. August drafters would be able to take advantage of the reduced prices on these players and build combination with better players I wouldn't have been able to draft. Thus, they have the advantage of drafting players with better odds of not being the Chase Claypool of Mac Collinses or the Tyrion Davis price of Raheem Mostert's. The majority of Griddy's teams were drafted in June, and Griddy maxed his 150 entries in early July, before training camp even started. And if you look at this team, it was drafted June 30th.
Wow.
However, drafting early gives you the advantage of having positive closing line value. Thus, you were able to draft players like Xavier Worthy, Isaiah Pacheco, Jordan Mason, Cooper Kupp, Rico Dowdle, and Dontavian Wicks at much cheaper prices. Reaching on players early completely nullifies this value, giving both the downside of lack of information that August drafters have, and the lack of upside of getting positive closing line value that the early drafters have. If Griddy is reaching 3 rounds for players and is only drafting early, leading to bad closing line value due to poor information, I can only imagine what his real-time and closing line value is for many of these drafts. Oops! The Griddy school would easily defend this with being unique or having unique combinations. You have to stick it to big receiver, otherwise how long will Best Ball be around? Well, let's see how useful it is to get unique.
Streamers don't have player takes.
Over my documentation of HitEmWithTheGriddy, I noticed some arguments very much in line with the Griddy school. Some of these tweets I feel have some truth to them, but tend to be missing the point of how this tournament works. while others I just can't get behind. For example, here's one tweet discussing closing line value. This tweet is arguing about the uniqueness of playoff advancing teams in rounds 2 through 4. You will play against other teams that had your player in the playoff round, so generally having less teams that advance your player gives you leverage over other drafters.
And when everyone's super,
no one will be.
For example, Christian McCaffrey is advancing at around 4%, a disastrously low advance rate, and thus has a massive leverage over the field if advance rates stay low at the end of round 1. This particular tweet does not understand closing line value. Bestball Mania involves a large number of teams, with around 50% of entries spanning from around late July to early September. If a player had bad closing line value, that means other players that had your player had them at much cheaper prices and combined them with much better players. Let's do some 2v2 comparisons, where we look at pairs of players being drafted in 2 rounds and see how those duos compare. For example, if Ken Walker hits and is the guy you need, is drafting him at 58 just as good as at 68? Maybe. Having Ken Walker and Brian Thomas is probably no worse off than Ken Walker and Jaden Reed. Maybe Ken Walker and Keenan or Deontay Johnson is worse, but there are still hits here. How about drafting him at 30? A little more extreme now? Now you have to match your Ken Walker and Deontay Johnson, or Brian Thomas, with their Ken Walker and Derrick Henry. The jump from pick 68 to pick 30 is how close Rashee Rice jumped this season. While Rice got a season-ending injury and is thus a big bust, you can see how huge of an impact closing line value can be. If Rashee played the whole season, these early teams would have had a massive advantage over their competition. Teams that get the guy you need later are more likely to advance and are more impactful because they have more good players than those who don't. While reaching might work on an individual level, doing this over an entire draft is just replacing good players with worse ones. For the sake of uniqueness you already have if the guy is low owned.
the only thing hyper-fragile is the psyche and frames of these streamers.
Contrary. Next, let us return to Chase Claypool.
Fiddle my Claypool.
During the preseason, people used Chargers rookie running back Kamani Vidal potentially being cut by the Chargers to justify Griddy's shares of Chase Claypool. Griddy even endorsed one of these tweets, as he drafted only 2 shares of Vidal. Mattek even facetiously disparaged his bags of Vidal. It was looking to be Jover. Because of this, some Griddy School adjacent defenders said Claypool wasn't a bad pick. Because Vidal was also bad? This is what we call a whataboutism, an extremely common logical fallacy to deflect criticism by presenting another unrelated argument. Clearly it was better to take Claypool and be unique than draft Vidal and not be? To be fair, our friend Sven has a bit of a point about Vidal's opportunity cost being higher, but not by much. But none of this matters because Kamani Vidal wasn't cut, played in week 6, and got a touchdown on his first play. Oops! Finally, let's look at the Derrick Henry drama over the past few weeks. As established earlier in this video, Derrick Henry was drafted a lot by Griddy, and is very successful. As funny as Davis Mattek's one singular share of Derrick Henry was, he was not alone in his fading of Derrick Henry. Several notable names faded Derrick Henry this year. One particular man was Davis's streaming partner, Liam Murphy, who I would say is a generally smart guy. Let me try to damage control here before the Griddy School persecutes Davis, and particularly Liam, who was not on this particular running back. Let me be clear that the Derrick Henry fade was not a good idea this year. But as I have said time and time again in this series, the guy you need matters more in the playoff weeks. Week 7 is halfway through round 1, which is the equivalent of being halfway through the first quarter of a game of football. Nobody in their right mind would be victory lapping the equivalent of 8 minutes into a game, so why the Claypool doing that right now? Not to mention, this particular tweet isn't even criticizing Derrick Henry drafters, but rather pointing out the archetype of players that were drafted with him by drafters.
I like 'em big, I like 'em chunky, I like 'em big, I like 'em lumpy, I like 'em round,
Fiddle my cooch.
Najee Harris and Derrick Henry are both similar big bruiser RB archetypes that don't catch passes. Chase Brown, on the other hand, is a relatively small, low rush volume pass catching running back, which, along with another small running back, Jalen Warren, was not paired with Derrick Henry often. Drafting Derrick Henry with Chase Brown or Jalen Warren is actually a pretty favorable way to get unique. If this unique 2v2 combination hits, you have leverage over the field. The Griddy school was obviously threatened by the mention of not drafting running backs early, as they came full force on this tweet. The zero receiver rebels are winning against big receivers so far, so I don't see why they need to be this worried. You already blew up the Death Star, or the train, or whatever was in V for Vendetta. I haven't watched in a while. I get Liam comes off as very smug in some of his tweets, but these reactions are much more personal and are a really annoying part of fantasy Twitter. At least Griddy doesn't come after content creators specifically. Again, we still have over a month to go before the Bestball playoffs. The Griddy school won the battle, but definitely has not won the war. We will return next time for the continuation of the battle between Big Receiver and the Griddy school. This time Griddy will need a true hero, Receiver. Until then, please pray for your favorite players' knees. This year has been brutal for injuries. And as always, stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
I think if Chase Claypool didn't get hurt, he would still be on the Bills team, and he would have been playing some. So, given a W there to hit him with the Griddy, directionally accurate.
He should have just taken Tyrell Shavers.
Davis, do you want to address, though, like being kind of negative on today's show?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to address it. When you watch, like $30,000 of entries just go up in the smoke because Mahomes has decided to beat Gardner Minshew, does it feel good? No. Does it make me excited about football to know that best case scenario, I've lost a year's worth of mortgage payments? Does any of that make me feel good about fantasy football? David doesn't. It doesn't, actually.
Let him cook. Let him cook.
Like, super sick run out for me. Lose my job. Start this YouTube channel. Like, all right, we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. I'm all in. I'm streaming every day. I'm building all these sick teams with my friends. Every year Bestball Mania has existed, I have advanced a minimum of 20% of my teams.
Where are you right now?
I've only ever been worse than 22% one time. The year I lose my job and I try and make this my full-time job, I'm going to advance 8% of my teams. Does that make me jazzed, David? Do you think I'm ready to sell insurance? Do you think State Farm is hiring, David? Because I don't think State Farm is hiring. No one's hiring, David. It's not great. Subscribe to my YouTube channel so I don't have to send my dog back to the farm where I got it from.
Don't say that.
Who's gonna buy her food, Dave? Xavier Worthy sure as Claypool isn't.